All right, so today we're looking at PFT 101, right? So here's our day by day. So PFT 101, this is going to be fitness essentials and assessments, right? So this is where we are going to be looking at all of the different fitness assessments in your overall NASM textbook. We'll talk about a few extra ones as well, because we are going to be going into PFT 102 in this module. That'll be the end of this module, where we get into the sports class, which is really fun. That'll be our sports program design class. That'll be the last class before the end of the year, before we take our winter break as well. And then we'll be back, beginning of the year after that. It'll be 2021, and hopefully it'll be better than 2020. This nonsense year. So in this fitness assessments class, I always like to tell people, it's an assessments class, right? Like that's really what it is. But I kind of like to think of it as kinesiology 2. Like it's kinesiology's little brother, because we are going to see a lot of, we're going to talk about those kinesiology concepts again. We're going to talk about knee flexion and knee extension, and we're going to remember those terms, because when we get down here to our movement assessments, where we're looking at a standing row assessment or single leg squat or an overhead squat, right? When we're looking at those types of assessments, we need to understand oh, okay, their knees are caving in, right? Which means that they are experiencing, knee adduction and knee internal rotation and ankle, internal rotation, right? Like hip internal rotation. We got to understand that it's all those things are happening simultaneously. And then we got to go back to our understanding of kinesiology and be okay, well, if they're doing internal rotation, I need to strengthen their external rotators. And if their knees are adducting, I need to strengthen their abductors, right? So you got to do the opposite. And so we already talked about that in kinesiology. I know you guys kind of know that, but that's sort of how we tie it to our assessment concepts. And we've done a little bit of that work already, but that's really what the main focus of this class is. We are also going to do a quick overview, though, of our nervous and skeletal systems, our muscular system as well. So we're going to go through NASM Chapter 2 again. We're also going to go over the physiology overview. So we're going to go into NASM's metabolism chapter in this class. Because it's not only about movement assessments, it is also about cardiovascular assessments. So we are going to look at our cardiorespiratory system as well. So we're looking at both of those things in this course, going over kinesiology again really briefly. And then just before the middle of this class, right? So right before our midterm, we're going to be going over our 3 most common static postural distortions. So we are going to do a little bit of assessing, sort of. I mean, not really assessing. I mean, we'll see it in the assessment PowerPoint. We're not really going into assessing before the midterm. We're going into these 3 most common postural distortions and what muscles are sort of causing them, right? So the 3 most common, these are called jaundice postural distortions. The 3 most common are the pronation distortion, the lower crossed, and the upper crossed. And we talked about them in our kines class, but pronation distortion is that feet flattening and externally rotating. So we see the feet turn out, knees, feet flatten, and then knees caving in simultaneously. So you see that knee valgus, right? Lower cross syndrome, which is that anterior pelvic tilt, and then upper cross syndrome, which is that forward head posture with shoulder rounding. So we're going to be looking at all 3 of those and what muscles are causing them as we transfer into sort of the more complicated versions of assessment. So then we'll kind of actually back off a little bit, go through the PAR-Q and all the subjective stuff, work our way through the movement assessments, work our way into some performance assessments. I know in this class, we're probably only going to get a chance to talk about our percentage of 1 rep max assessments rather than really practice them, just because of how class is right now, unless we get a chance to kind of maybe do if things relax by time it's, time to get in there, and then I can show you guys how to do all the 1 rep max assessments as well. So that is our schedule. Do you guys have any questions about where we're headed? Anything you're worried about or anything that wasn't clear? Yeah, what's up, Irene?
Yeah, just on the chapters. Did you mention that it was chapter 9 in our textbook, but it's chapter 2? and 5 and 4?
Oh yeah. So it's the main chapter we're going to be in is 9. That's the assessments chapter in your textbook. Like, it's what this class is named after. But I don't want to teach you assessments unless, like, we have reviewed anatomy and physiology and kinesiology, right? Like, we want to make sure that we have all that baseline knowledge.
Uh-huh.
Again, it's kind of like going back to like the alphabet before we, read this new book that we're going into,
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're gonna go chapters 2. That's the that's the kinetic chain chapter where we do like muscular system, skeletal system, nervous system. Then we'll do chapter 4, which is like the cardio metabolism chapter. Then we'll do chapter 7, which is kinesiology, I want to say, but I'm not confident. And then
I think
chapter
it's
9.
chapter 5. Oh, I see. Okay, got it.
Yeah, maybe it's chapter 5. Yeah, I think you might be right. I can't believe after all this time I don't have the chapters memorized. But it's harder than you think. They're all screwed up. And also, like, it felt like I had them for a while. Then we did this random 5th edition, and now my brain's screwed up forever. Never been good with the chapters. All right, so chapter 2, basic exercise science, right? So we are looking back at the kinetic chain here. And I know everybody has kind of already seen this PowerPoint. We'll talk about it from a slightly different perspective. We are, that's the thing about, like, when we're looking at these things, from last time we saw these, we were looking at kinesiology, and I spent a lot of time talking about how, you need to understand this so we understand the movement of things. In the physiology class, we went over these slides, and I spend my time talking about, like, the energy production side of it. Well, in this class, it's very similar to the kinesiology, right? We're going to be very much looking at the movement side of it, because it is all about, like, how it's performing versus how it really should be performing. So purpose of this is to understand the fundamental concepts that pertain to the kinetic chain, right? That muscular, skeletal, and nervous systems working together. Understand our basic and physiologic functions. That's really what we're going over today. So today we're looking at the nervous and the skeletal systems. So we're looking at the two movers, or the two structural ones, right? Where, like, your nervous system gives you structures that you have a communication network. Your skeletal system gives you structures that your muscles have a place to rest and something to move around. And we'll talk about how those adapt and respond to stress. So as we're looking at it, right, like this PowerPoint's kind of split up into 2 days. You've got the human movement system in general, right? So that is more commonly referred to as the kinetic chain, or, back and forth, I guess. And it's 3 interdependent systems that work together that are responsible for creating and manipulating human movement. So when we look at the kinetic chain, right, the reason we call it a chain is because you want to remember, you want to think that, like, they're linked together. And when one, link in a chain is compromised, it's going to affect the other links. Yeah, that's where that phrase comes from. Like, you're only as strong as your weakest link, right? That's referring to, like, a chain of things, right? And so the kinetic chain, these 3 interdependent systems, if your nervous system doesn't function properly, it can't control your muscular system properly, which means that your muscles are going to be recruited the wrong way, which means they're going to move your skeletal system the wrong way, right? And so then we're going to be inefficient. And that sort of happens to us over time, unfortunately, because your nervous system is also, like, a system that works by coding information through repetition. So when you do the same thing over and over and over and over and over again, it reinforces your nervous system, which reinforces your muscular system, and then makes you move the skeletal system in that bad habit. And that's why we have these very common postural distortions, where we see the knees caving in, or the feet turning out, or the shoulders rounding, right? And, or we could go the other direction. Like, let's say, like, that was if the nervous system sort of started this circle of not awesome, right? But it could also be your muscular system, like if you, get tackled or something while playing sports, or you experience some traumatic event at work or something like that, well, then you're going to get some type of adhesion. You're going to have, like, some trauma or something. That adhesion is going to get inflamed, and then those muscle fibers are going to be shortened and kind of stiff. And then your nervous system, and then that's going to move your skeletal system in a way that it's not really designed to move. So your nervous system is going to step in and say, okay, well, we can't move that way. Let's try this instead. So it'll do an altered posture instead. and now you're moving the wrong way. Maybe you have something like synergistic dominance, where maybe a helper muscle is taking over instead of like the right muscle for the job, you know? And now you're moving the wrong way, and eventually, you know, it causes too much stress to the skeletal system, and bada bing, bada boom, you've got an injury, right? Or it could be your skeletal system, right? You could experience like an ankle sprain, and an ankle sprain, you know, you have to keep the weight off of it. Well, that skeletal system then is really tender, and so you don't want to put too much weight on it, so then you don't walk properly, so you stop recruiting your glutes, so then you get a weakened glute muscle, and then that weakened glute muscle can't be recruited by the nervous system effectively, and there you are again. We're back in that injury cycle. So, you know, it goes in all three directions. We want all three of these to be equally strong because they are all equally interdependent, right? They all rely on each other. Kinetic obviously means forces, right? Chain is a system of things linked together. And again, if one component is sort of out of whack, all of them are out of whack, you know? So we are looking today primarily at the nervous system and the skeletal system. But just a quick brief overview of all three of these. You got the nervous system, which is responsible for creating a communication network throughout the body, which always seems kind of surprising. Like, you don't really think of your nervous system as like a communication network. Like, I mean, I don't know what you guys think of your nervous systems. I have, like, you know, we all kind of have our, you know, our sort of own thoughts and things. Like, I saw a meme one time that made me laugh really hard because I was like, that's totally true. And it was that the brain is the only organ that got to name itself. Like when we were coming up with language as like a species, the brain is the one that came up with one. We call it the brain. And that's so dumb, but I just think that's really funny. But that's your nervous system, right? It's a communication network. It's getting information in, making decisions, and sending information out. And then it's getting information, you know, once it gets all the way back, you know, did it work? And then it gets more information coming back in. And so it's just constantly relaying information back and forth. And then you get your muscular system, which is responsible for creating internal tension in order to manipulate the skeletal system and create human movement, right? So when we look at like your muscular system is a series of little muscle fibers, little muscle cells that all come together, and they're all arranged to be able to shorten and relax, right? And so if they do that and they're attached to something on both ends, right? Like if I'm attached over here, I'm attached over here, and I shorten and I relax, and I shorten and I relax, I'm going to be moving something towards me, right? So if I was attached to, say, a bone over here and another bone over here, well, now that bone is going to be, you know, those two bones are going to be manipulated, and they're going to move, right? And that's what your skeletal system it comes in. And so your muscular system is creating the tension to create the movement, and your skeletal system is acting as the levers to, you know, be that movement. And that's where we get there right there. Like that wasn't a sentence. That's what we get right here. The skeletal system provides a framework for the body, protecting delicate structures and allowing the muscular system to have a series of levers to manipulate, right? And so that's our kinetic chain in sort of a nutshell there, right? So today we're going to start off by talking about our nervous system. And the nervous system is one of the three main organ systems that, like I said, it has these specialized cells that help transmit and coordinate signals, right? That's how we create that communication network inside the body. So when we look at like the nervous system, right? And you look at it, you can see like all these different like nerves and tracts running throughout the body, right? Like look at all this like huge communication network, right? And so what's happening here is like, this is going to like give you some information about like anything in that section of the body. And you'll notice that it all branches out from the center section here, right? Like you've got your brain, and then it travels down the spinal cord, and from right there, it starts branching out like crazy. And that's where you have each of your individual like spinal discs. So when you look at like, you know, in here, you've got your spinal cord, right? And that's like this kind of main section being protected by all of your individual like vertebrae. And then what happens is like, you know, from each of those vertebrae, it's got a special little like root that will branch out. And then that kind of creates this communication network. I mean, I'd be kind of curious, what do the internet lines in the city of Los Angeles look like? Be kind of curious to see what the internet looks like. Let's see if they even have something like that. No, I don't know how to Google this. It's probably something like this. Something just crazy. But that's, you know, that's a communication network, right? You think about like all the streets throughout LA, you know, there's all these wires and cables running in underneath all that stuff. And so, you know, that's creating this big network, and there's information able to go, you know, to your house and my house, and then there's information able to come back from my house and back from your house. You know, that's exactly how your nervous system works. And so, you know, information might go to the hand to cause it to squeeze, and then information is going to go back to the brain to say, hey, we've got something in our hand, you know? So your nervous system is amazing. Your nervous system is my favorite to talk about. I just think it's so freaking cool. So there's two main divisions here. Before we kind of get into all of that, actually, you got two main divisions of your nervous system, right? You've got the central system, which is going to be your brain and your spinal cord, and you've got the peripheral nervous system, which are all those nerves that we just talked about running throughout the body. So the brain and the spinal cord, right? The central nervous system, that's really the command center of everything, right? Like that's really where you know, all of the decision making gets made, right? And so like when information comes, let's say like I grab something, right? And like, you know, I've got something in my hand here, there's going to be information coming back to my brain in a couple different ways, right? There's information in my skin saying like, hey, that's nice and cool. You know, it's smooth, it's not sharp, it's not dangerous, right? Information's going back, like all the nerves in my hand are like, man, we're not getting damaged, so we can keep holding on to this, right? There's information coming from my shoulder, because obviously like it's heavy, and so it's like pulling down on gravity, right? And so like all that information is going back to my brain, and my brain's interpreting all of it. Now, if I went to go grab this and it was, let's say 1,000 degrees, right? Well, if it was 1,000 degrees, it would melt my hand off. But yeah, let's say it was like 300 degrees, like, you know, practically boiling, right? If I grab something like this, that's going to be so hot that it's going to instantly, you know, damage the tissues of my hand. And so my nervous system is designed to be really sensitive to stuff like that. And so what it'll do is it'll, you know, almost automatically just drop that, and I won't even be able to hold on to it, right? And that's very much like a nervous system reaction, right? So the information went up to my brain and said, hey, like this is the type of stuff that usually creates like damage in us. And so then my brain goes, all right, well then the correct course of action is to let go, right? And so then that information would go back and it would recruit the muscles that would cause me to open my hand. So your central nervous system, like I said, it's in charge of all that decision making, but the information getting to the brain, right? Like the sensory information in my palm, you know, traveling up to my brain, and the motor information traveling down to recruit my muscles to open up my hand, that was all part of my peripheral nervous system. So like the central nervous system creates the decisions, the peripheral nervous system sort of carries out the actions, if that makes sense. You can think of this as like the CEO of a company who's, you know, deciding what direction to take that company in, and the peripheral nervous system is all the workers in the factory who are in charge of like carrying out, you know, those jobs. Like I said, your nervous system, again, allows us to gather information about our internal and external environments, and then interpret that information and respond. And so we have three primary functions of our nervous system here, and we've already kind of been talking about these. And so when we look at the three primary functions, right, we're looking at the jobs, like why do we have a nervous system? Like, what does it do, right? The three things that it does, it has sensory function, integrative function, and motor function. So you want to think of these as, I like to think of these as like direction based almost, you know? So sensory function is information going towards my brain. Motor function is information coming from my brain. And then integrative function is like the decision making that's happening in between, right? So sensory function is the ability of the nervous system to sense changes in either the internal or external environment. So in the example I just gave, right, the little nerves that are in the skin of my hand and in the, you know, in my shoulder there, like those are the things that are doing most of the work right now, right? So that's sensory function. They're sensing information, and that information is going back to my brain, right? Now you can absolutely mess with your sensory information, you know, that information can, you know, maybe not get picked up on, or it can be confused, you know, it can be like the wrong type of information. You know, for instance, like have you ever been like fooled by like you can fool your nervous system? You ever see those videos? I can't remember what they're called, but there's this box that you can put your hand into, and it creates like a mirror of your other arm. And then like what'll happen is like somebody will inevitably like, hit that other hand, and then you'll flinch even though you're not even being touched. Your brain is like you're confusing your sensory information, right? And so your brain is getting the wrong type of info. Now, when your brain gets information from sensory, when it gets sensory info, what happens is it tries to sort of piece it all together to understand really like what's going on, right? Or what decisions to make. And that's where your integrative function takes place. Integrative function is your nervous system's ability to analyze and interpret that sensory information. That allows for you to make the proper decision making, right? So this is where your nervous system is really kind of figuring out like what the appropriate course of action is. Like if you send sensory information saying, hey, that's really, 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 really hot, your brain's gonna go, oh, okay, well, the last time I touched something really, really hot, we ended up like with a scar on our hand, right? And so like, it's like, okay, so I'm gonna say let go. That's the integrative function, right? Just like, if you were to like, this is a really weird version of the world, and I apologize if this is just such a weird example. But like, imagine if like you grew up in a world where, you moved to another country where they just used a totally different set of systems for like how to drive. For the most part, I think the whole world is on board with like the whole red light, green light, yellow light thing. But like if you just went to a different place and like that wasn't the system, you'd have to kind of like take in some information and then like run it past your past experiences in order to kind of figure out like what the appropriate course of action is. You'd be like, okay, every time I see that purple light, all the cars start driving. I guess that means I probably shouldn't cross this crosswalk. But every time I see that blue light, all the cars stop and it's safe for me to cross. So you're running that, like you took information in, you're running it past your past experiences. That's your integrative function, right? It's information that you hold on to in order to make the appropriate responses later, right? So you got sensory information going to the brain. Integrative function is the brain choosing what to do. And then you have motor function, which is the execution of the appropriate response, right? Like if it was that crosswalk, it'd be like you starting to walk. But motor function is where your nervous system sort of leverages the resources that it has in order to, perform some type of action. So for instance, like again, if you grab something really, like let's say, let's say like this ended up weighing, right now it weighs like, I don't know, 1 pound, 2 pounds. But let's say like somehow it went from weighing 1 to 2 pounds to weighing like 25 pounds, right? Well, immediately when I try to lift that, my nervous system is through sensory information going to go, hey, this got a lot heavier. Then my integrative function is going to go, okay, well, when something is that heavy, we need to recruit this many muscle fibers, right? And then my motor function is going to carry that out. So my integrative function will go, we need 25 muscle fibers, just picking up a fake number. And then all of a sudden I can lift that 25-pound jar now. And so that's your motor function. That's the response to your sensory information. So sensory information goes towards the brain, motor information comes from the brain, and integrative function is how you decide what type of motor function to recruit and what type of sensory information is coming in. Now, all those were very much like conscious examples, like we're kind of feeling and seeing those, right? But there's a lot of unconscious examples as well. There's a lot of like autonomic stuff that you don't really realize is happening in your nervous system, but it's still very much response to sensory info and integrative info and motor info. And so like, let's say it's like internal in your body, right? You don't have any control over how fast your digestive system processes foods, for instance. But when you bring food into your stomach, it's going to sit in this little acid bath for a little while. And once it's broken down into kind of a soupy mixture, right, it's going to move on to your small intestine so that all that nutrition can get absorbed, right? So how did your nervous system know when to open up your stomach? Well, you have stretch receptors in there. And so those stretch receptors, when they get, tripped, when they get like stretched, that's sensory information. It's going to your brain. You don't necessarily consciously feel it, but that information is going to your brain, and your brain goes, oh, the food must be ready. And so then like it, figures that out. And so integrative function then also decides, okay, well, let's open up that valve to the, to the small intestine, open that up, and now all that food's going to pass. And so that's an example of sensory, integrative, and motor function. Do you guys have any questions about those? I feel like that was a long tear. Yeah, go. What's up, Irene?
Yes, I understand it for the most part, but I'm wondering, like, say if you were to touch something and it's hot, what comes first? Is it the motor sensor,
sensory info first. So your nervous system doesn't know that it's hot until it touches it. But it does seem incredibly fast, right? Your nervous system is lightning quick. And I say that literally because it is a series of electrochemical signals. So it is as fast as lightning. Like it is, zapping to your brain. Now, there are special, like a lot of times, I said that your central nervous system is in charge of integrative function, right? And that's still true. But remember, your central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. It's not just your brain. Now, if it's like a panicky signal, right? Like, or if let's say it's a regular signal, right? Let's say it's a regular cool cup of coffee that you grabbed, right? That's a signal that, because it's not very dangerous, it's going to get to your spinal cord, it's going to travel up to your brain. Your brain's going to go, hey, there's delicious coffee in there, and it's not too hot. And then that information is going to go back and it's going to, lift it to your face. But let's say, like your example, you said it was super hot, right? So in signals that are really intense, like when the sensory information coming in is so intense that it is dangerous, it will actually get to your spinal cord, and instead of traveling up to the brain to go make a decision, it'll travel right back. It'll make a simple reflex decision. And simple reflex decisions are actually made at your spine rather than in your brain. And it's because it's a protective mechanism, because it's so intense, we don't have time to send it up here, because this guy overthinks everything. It takes time. It's like, well, you said that it was hot, but how hot really was it? Like there was a time that we touched something that was hot. It's like weighing all the pros and cons and like, making a big decision. It's like, hey, listen, nerd, this thing's really hot. We got to move, and that's where your spine comes in. Your spine is like simple, jerk the hand away, and that's often why, like when you get scared, like when somebody like jumps out of nowhere, and you're just like, blah, and you like, you do all this stuff. It's like, this isn't helping, right? Like that's your spine taking over. And then your brain gets a second to kind of realize and sort of calm down. So does that answer your question? That's how it's always sensory first. Motor information is always a response to sensory information. Is that good? Sorry, I had you closed down. I couldn't see if you did the thumbs up.
Yeah, no, thanks for clearing that up. Thank
you. All right, so now that we understand like info coming in, info going out, and then interpreting info, we got to understand our best concept of the day, most important concept of the day, proprioception. Proprioception is your body's ability to sense the relative position of adjacent body parts. Or sometimes you'll hear this say, I don't know, did I have this in here? It is what is the sentence? It's the cumulative neural input from all sensory receptors in the body. It's like, I don't know, that's not either of those are sometimes a little hard to understand. So I like this version. It's your spatial awareness. It's your body's understanding of where it is in space, right? So proprioception, right? That's how we have balance. That's how we have coordination. That's how we have posture even, all of those things, right? Like, Robert, I think this happened to you, right? Because this happens to so many people all the time, like tight calves, right? Tight calves are the number one, like it's usually the most common tight muscle that we tend to see in our jobs. And inevitably you'll have someone go do like a calf stretch and they'll go, man, I can really feel it. That's great. And then it's like, okay, but I need you to keep your ankle straight. And they're like, what? It is straight. And then they look back and it's turned at an angle like this. That's an altered proprioception, right? Like the information coming to your brain is the information that it has been getting for a very, very long time. So it's not used to the fact that it's like, actually, this is straight. This is turned out. This is straight, you know, like, but your brain's like, no, we've been doing that for so long, you know. That's sort of like an altered version of proprioception. So, you know, proprioception is like info coming in and info coming out, and your body's using that info to understand where it is in space, you know? Like if I raise my hand out to the side like this, and let's say I'm like looking over here, I still know that my palm is face down. I know that my arm's abducted at my side because I'm getting info, you know, going back to my brain. And sometimes people oversimplify proprioception. They don't think it's that important of a concept. They're like, you know, but when I tell people it's like how your brain knows that it's happening, you know, what is happening is happening. That's a really important concept, you know? And sometimes it's like, how did I know that I raised my arm? And this, you know, somebody could very simply answer and say, because you're the one who told your arm to raise. Yeah, that's a great answer, but it doesn't actually answer the other half of it. But it's like, how do I know it happened? Right? Like, yeah, absolutely. I'm the one who like, you know, hey, arm, raise, you know, like I'm the one who said it. So, but, you know, I've told my roommates to do the dishes before and it hasn't happened. You know, you know, how do I know it actually occurred? Well, that's where you have to get the information coming back. And so it's a two-way network constantly happening. That's your proprioception. I had a student in the PFT program who had had a stroke in her past. She had a stroke, and so she had nerve damage in her legs. She couldn't feel information coming back from her legs, but she could tell her legs like what to do. She had full control of her body, but she had like nerve sensation that she couldn't feel. So she had very altered proprioception. So she would always have to like look down and adjust her feet and knees whenever she was doing things like squats or lunges or whatever. But it was incredible. I mean, like, she had developed this sort of, she could tell from like other things. She could tell from like other pieces of information where she could still feel stuff, like whether or not that, that version of a squat felt different than, maybe some other version. So it was really cool. So that's your proprioception. It's your body's understanding of where it is in space. And we are always, always, always trying to enhance proprioception as much as we can.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna put this in a baseball reference. Is
Ooh.
Proprioception kind of like when they're running back towards the wall and without looking at the wall, they can understand kind of just by putting their arm up?
Yeah,
like,
they can know where it is, right?
Yeah, without looking like back at the wall, right?
Yes, I would say that's a good example of some type of proprioception. It's not 100% just proprioception. Like obviously a lot of that is just practice and experience, right? Like they've just done it a million times. They know how far the wall is, right? But the proprioceptive part of it is, how that like they know that they took, their brain is like, okay, we just took a backward step, and it knows how long the legs are, and it knows like, based on how much stretch it experienced, it knows that it took this type of step versus this type of step, right? So like, that information coming in, your brain's basically doing a bunch of that math and a bunch of those calculations like in super fast real time. And that's what's getting them back to the wall without kind of slamming into it, right? And obviously that proprioception can be altered. It's not always perfect. But yeah, absolutely. I'd say that's a good example. I like that. So zooming out of like the kind of concepts here and zooming in, let's look at the nervous system neurons here, right? Let's look at the workers. So your nervous system is, made up of a whole bunch of little individual neurons, right? So one of the things you guys always hear me say is like function follows form, right? So everything is shaped in a certain way so that it can act a certain way. And if something is shaped a certain way, then it will act a certain way. And so the neuron is really cool. This is a specialized type of cell. I know that like a lot of times we're drawing like, you know, cells in like biology, we'll say like biology cell. You know, it's this, you always see them like just kind of look like this, right? We kind of just see your classic sort of like animal cell here, just like a circle. But most of the cells in your body are actually very, very, very specialized. They look very specific. You know, they look very specific ways, right? So for instance, we see like a neuron, which is a nervous system cell, you know, they look like this. They aren't that kind of big blob. And so the reason they look like this is because you can see here, look at how all these neurons are connected to other neurons, right? This is creating that communication network we talked about. And so when you look at these cells, you'll see they have all these special little structures on them. That's what allows them to be so good at creating that communication network, because like these little dendrites right here, these little fingers are really good at attaching to these little axon terminals and other dendrites. And so you can tie them all together because they got little fingers, right? And so that finger can tie to that finger and that one can tie to that one. And so that's going to create this communication. And that's what different thoughts and actions actually are. Like for instance, if I go back to this picture here, you know, if you were to travel from this neuron to this neuron, over to this neuron, right? If you were to go this way, that's maybe your brain sensing the color blue. But if it were to travel from this neuron to this neuron, and then maybe over to this one over here instead, that'd be your brain sensing the color green. So like you've only got so many, you got all these like billions of neurons, and they can create all these different combinations as they're sort of traveling to your brain. And depending on what route they took and what combination of neurons were recruited, that's going to give you different thoughts and different actions. So I always love to tell people this, like your thoughts are physical things. They are electrochemical signals. And when it travels from A to B to C, that's a different thought than A to C to X, you know, that's a totally different, you know, one is salty, one is sweet. So that is sort of how your nervous system is sort of working. It's billions upon billions of neurons. There are just so many of them. And we've got three different major categories of neurons. We've got your sensory neurons, which are going to be neurons that transmit nerve impulses from effector sites to the brain, or they're going to go to the spinal cord. They're going to the central nervous system. So your sensory neurons, like I said earlier, sensory information is coming towards the brain, right? Sensory neurons are the ones that are, oh, my internet's crapping out. Hold on, sorry, we'll give this just a second. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you got choppy words though.
Yeah, okay. I'll speak a little slowly for a bit and see how long that lasts. So sensory neurons are coming from effector sites going towards the brain. Just like I said, sensory information is going towards the brain, right? These are what we call afferent neurons, right? And so afferent neurons, they are affected by outside sources, right? So like if a muscle senses that it's lengthening, that information is going to go to the brain, right? So if I take my bicep and I lengthen it out, right? Well, there's a stretch neuron in here, and so it's being stretched out. So that information is like, okay, I'm being stretched out, so it's going towards the brain. My brain now is sensing the fact that I'm lowering my arm, right? Or again, if you touch something hot, right, the receptors in your skin are going to send a signal to your brain and say like, hey, that's really hot. So those are your sensory neurons, right? Then you have motor neurons, which are the ones going to an effector site. So like they transmit efferent nerve impulses from the brain to effector sites, such as like a muscle or an organ, right? So this is going to go like your motor neurons are going to come from your brain and go to your arm, right? So like, let's say like I'm stretching this arm out, but I do it super fast and I like jerk it and slam my elbow into itself, right? Well, that's going to be way too rapid of a stretch. And so that might create like a little bit of elbow pain. So now a motor neuron is going to say, okay, well, let's contract back the other direction, because the sensory information I just got means that like we might tear that bicep. And so it contracts a little bit in the opposite direction, back, go to an effector site. So a muscle contracts in response to being over lengthened. That's a motor response. So sensory neurons are information going to the brain. Motor neurons are information coming from the brain. And sensory neurons are at a site, right, in charge of censoring information, and motor neurons are at a site in charge of like recruiting muscles or glands in order to like, create some type of effect. And then all of your interneurons are the ones that are, going from place to place to place to place to place to place. So you've got all these interneurons, right? You don't just have like one big neuron that is traveling. Sorry, God, my phone's blowing up. Shut up. So you've got sensory neurons that are at a site. You got motor neurons, which are going to a site, and you got interneurons, which are all the neurons in between. So I don't have just like one neuron from my brain all the way down to my foot. Although you do have one really large one. You do have one giant motor neuron from like about the base of your spine down to your like the lower parts of your leg, attached from like your sciatic nerve. That one's huge. But for the most part, like, you have a lot of like interneurons, so they can get from place to place to place to place to place. All right, so now let's go ahead and look at, we have kind of talked about the divisions here already, but we kind of need to understand like how they divide down and what they're in charge of, right? So when we're looking at the nervous system, it's going to be divided into, two main sections, kind of like we talked about. You got the central nervous system. That's the head honcho, right? That's in charge of like making all of your decisions, whether that decisions, most of them, they're made in your brain, right? But some of them, like I said, are made at your spine. If the signal's so intense, I always like to think of it as like your brain, again, is like the CEO, right? It's in charge of like making all the main decisions. It's the main owner of a factory, right? And the spinal cord is like where all the, this is still like management, but like, let's say, but it's like management's not allowed to really make that many decisions without running them past the main CEO. Like if you're a middle manager, you got to ask this, if you're allowed to, do something. But if there was like a dumpster fire in the middle of the factory floor, your spinal cord is just gonna be like, all right, well, I'm gonna put this out. It's gonna grab a fire extinguisher and just, do that job. It's not gonna go up to the, it's like, hey, there's a fire that's gonna burn the whole building down. Should I put that out? I just want to run all my decisions by you real quick. Like it's not doing that. It's gonna, make a decision real quick. But regardless, both of these guys here, those are the decision makers. That is their job. Your peripheral nervous system is in charge of either gathering info or executing info, right? So there are like, that's where, your sensory and motor functions are taking place. That's your peripheral nervous system there. So the peripheral nervous system is and actually really quickly, like I said, it's your brain and your spinal cord, and you can see all the different sections of your lumbar spine here, and you can see actually all the different like little roots there, and then see how all those roots actually branch out. So that's where your peripheral nervous system comes in. You've got cranial nerves up here, and you've got spinal nerves branching down here. And your spinal nerves are, again, that's where all the information's kind of being gathered or, being executed. And so when we look at like the role of your peripheral nervous system, it's really important to understand that it divides up into two sort of primary sections. It's going to be divided into a somatic section, which is responsible for conscious or voluntary movements, right? So this is where your body is like, if you make a decision to like blink your eyes, right? That's a somatic reaction, right? Like you are choosing to blink your eyes, right? But there are also autonomic reactions, and autonomic reactions are involuntary. So if somebody like got really close to your eyeball and like is attempting to poke it, right, you're gonna twitch a little bit and you're probably gonna blink because your nervous system is designed to protect itself. That's an autonomic reaction. That's one that you don't really have control over, right? So like for instance, all of your skeletal muscle, right, your core, glutes, abs, who's that? Is that pecs, lats, whatever, and all your skeletal muscle, that is all somatic muscle. You have control over that, right? You can choose to contract these muscles, and you have voluntary control over them. But if you look at like the smooth muscle of like your digestive system, right? That's all, you know, muscular as well. Or your heart, right? Your heart is very muscular. Both of those things are autonomic. They are going to be controlled by your nervous system, but they're happening without you consciously deciding to control them. We have no control over our heart rate, for instance. If your heart wants to speed up, it will. Now, don't get me wrong, you can think calming thoughts and meditate and things like that, which can slow your heart rate down, but that's still an autonomic response. You cannot voluntarily beat your heart faster or voluntarily slow your heart down. It will happen autonomically. You can think of it as automatically. So that is the two main sections of your nervous system there. You've got the somatic, which is voluntary, and the autonomic, which is involuntary. Now, autonomic is going to divide into two other main sections, or two other main decision types, right? Which are either going to be your fight or flight responses or your rest and digest responses. So these are either going to be, situations where your nervous system is going to freak out, or it's going to be a situation where your nervous system calms down something, right? So like, for instance, let's say you almost get into a car accident or something, right? Well, you know, your autonomic nervous system is going to activate all the fight or flight responses inside your body. You're going to start producing a bunch of cortisol and a bunch of other stress hormones, adrenaline and things like that. So you're probably going to get very anxious and fight or flighty, right? Now because you've got all this adrenaline coursing through your body, that kind of activates, you know, your whole nervous system, which recruits your muscles pretty easily after that point, which is why it did it, by the way, because now like you are in fight mode. Or maybe flight mode, you know, and so like it's your nervous system doesn't really understand that it's like, hey, it was a car that just swerved out of its lane for a second, now everything's totally fine. And that's why it takes so long for you to calm down when something like that happens. You're like, okay, oh, I'm calm. No, I'm not, you know. Like, that is very much your sympathetic fight or flight nervous system. It's hard to calm down sometimes. That's why, because it is autonomic. But you do have your parasympathetic nervous system. Your parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest system. So one of the reasons we warm up actually is to activate our sympathetic nervous system. Remember, exercise is a very stressful thing. It's a good, measured, positive type of stress, but it's stress nonetheless, you know? Like when you start exercising, your body is like, what are we, fighting something? You know, and so it's like getting very active. So we want to ease into that concept by doing a warm up, right? And that's going to give our nervous system time to kind of get recruited and get into like workout mode, fight or flight mode. And then what that does is that turns on all of your skeletal muscle. It turns on your heart, right? It gets all these things kind of active and ready, all the stuff that you need to fight a battle, right? Or run away from something. And then once you're done, you're going to do your cool down. And so you're going to like take that stress from a high level because you were working in the middle of your workout. Then you're going to take it into a cool down, which is where things get a little easier. And then you're going to leave the gym. And once you leave the gym, you know, you guys have heard of, I'm sure you've heard this traditional thing where they say, you want to eat within 30 minutes to an hour of working out because that's your nutrient uptake window. That is actually an example of something that is very bro science sounding, that is somewhat true. This is an example of like, you know, where it actually ends up kind of panning out in a good way. So after you're done exercising, your body goes into rest and digest mode. It just went into like sympathetic mode where it was freaking everything out, and it turned your digestive system off temporarily. I mean, like obviously it's going to do something, but like for the most part, like while you are doing like physical work, which is very like, you know, physical and fighty flighty, your other parts of your body, like you don't need to use that right now, you know? And so your body is kind of slowing down your digestive tract because it doesn't really have to do that much work with it. But after you're done exercising and after all that's over, your digestive system is going to get turned back on. That's why it's called the rest and digest phase. This sort of calms everything down. So it turns your muscles off and turns your digestive system back on. And that's also why, like, you tend not to be that hungry while you're working out, but you usually get pretty ravenous afterwards. So sympathetic reactions and amp stuff up, parasympathetic reactions sort of calm stuff down. Okay, so any questions about that stuff, by the way? All right, let's go ahead and, so we've been talking this whole time about info, right? Info coming in, info going out, right? All that stuff. Let's go ahead and look at how we're gathering that info, right? So this is one of my favorite parts to talk about, because I love talking about sensory receptors. I think they're just so fun. You get all these different types of sensory receptors in your body. And so what sensory receptors are is they're these specialized structures that are, throughout your whole body. They're responsible for transmitting environmental stimuli into information for your brain to be able to interpret. Can I show you guys a meme? I saw a meme yesterday. Let's see if I can find this. Data versus info versus knowledge versus wisdom meme. This is so funny. I saw this meme the other day and I love this so much because I hate conspiracy theories. This is just something about me. I'm really crass when it comes to people and conspiracy theories. And so you have like, I love this so much. You have data, which is just like raw numbers. But then you can interpret those raw numbers with information and be like, okay, well, this stuff means this and this stuff means that. And then if you can take all that information and draw some conclusions, well, now you have knowledge, right? And then, if you're an expert in the field with that type of knowledge, you have insight, right? And so now you're understanding like deeply certain things. And then with that insight, if you've used your insight like through experience and practice and things like that, and you are an expert in your field, that's where you have wisdom, right? And you can draw connections between your insights and stuff. Isn't that funny? And then you have conspiracy theories, which is just people drawing random conclusions that have nothing to do with reality from freaking data. So anyway, I love this. But the reason I bring it up, is mostly because I saw this meme the other day and I wanted to share it with somebody. No, is because that's what sensory receptors are. Sensory receptors are responsible for gathering information, right? They're going to gather data and info about your environment, right? Now, there's lots of different type of sensory receptors, right? Like if we look at our major categories here, yeah, I'm not gonna, yeah, okay, here we go. So you got all kinds of different types of sensory receptors, right? You've got like these ones right here that are in your skin. These are all in your skin, by the way, every single one of these. And I'm no skin expert. This is definitely not my, this is not one of my expert areas. But like Ruffini endings and Pacini corpuscles and things like that, they're there to sense like stretching. Like if you've ever given yourself, like, when kids would do that thing where they give you the twisties, and like, you're like, ow, that hurts, that burns my skin, right? Like that's, you're experiencing stretch. Well, you've got the same things in, that is exactly the same type of thing is happening in your muscles, right? In your muscles, you've got like Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindles, right? So these two guys here, these are also sensory receptors, right? And so this is information located at the tendon, and in your muscle spindle, this is information located throughout the belly of the muscle, right? So both those are going to work together to send information to your brain. Those are both examples of what we call mechanoreceptors, right? They are sensory receptors responsible for sensing mechanical or like physical changes, right? There's other receptors out there as well. You've got like nociceptors. They're receptors that for the most part just sit around doing nothing until a signal gets intense enough that it creates like pain. And so then all of a sudden they activate and they go, stop doing that, right? And that's where you go, ow, like, And that's why sometimes like you'll cut yourself without realizing it. Sometimes like your nociceptors are just sleeping on the job. You ever do that? Like walk by something, or maybe that's what you did. You don't really. A lot of times I end up with like some type of cut, and I'm like, where the hell did that come from? I'm bleeding. You know, and it's because your nervous system was just doing something else at the time. You get chemoreceptors. They respond to like smell and taste and things like that. Photoreceptors, they're in charge of like sensing light. And so like all kinds of, just so many different types of sensory receptors. But the big one we want to talk about are the sensory receptors. And we're not going to talk about the ones in your skin, although those are really cool. Instead, we are going to spend our time talking about these major three, the muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and then we're kind of just like lumping joint receptors together here. So their job is to sense things like stretch or tension, acceleration, deceleration, whatever. So muscle spindles, they're these guys right here. They're running throughout the belly of your muscle, right? So they run from like the entire length of your muscle, right? And their job is to tell your brain how long the muscle currently is, right? So like, again, go back to like proprioception. These sensory receptors are what is giving us proprioception. So like right now, my arms are resting at my side, right? Well, my latissimus dorsi, which is in charge of, you know, shoulder extension and shoulder adduction, right? You know, right now, this muscle's happy. It's like, I'm in a nice shortened state. You know, I'm not being pulled apart, which means like I'm at no risk for tearing. There's no way for me to really tear my lat muscle in a position like this with my hands at my sides. But if you take me into like, you know, shoulder extension or abduction, right? If you take me like far away, now this muscle's being stretched out. And, you know, that muscle spindle's in charge of like sensing all that info. So if it gets a really big signal, it might freak out. You know, if it's saying like, hey, we're being really stretched out right now, it's there to protect your muscle and keep it from being overstretched. So it might send a signal to the brain saying like, hey, we're getting pretty like stretched out here. You should probably contract a little bit so that we don't stretch any further. So then what ends up happening is like your body tries to find a way to shorten how much that muscle is being stretched out. Now, one of the other things that your lats do is it actually does just a little bit of back extension. So when it contracts, which is a shortening, right? So when I raise my arms up like this, my back might actually arch like this, and that takes some of the stretch away from my lats. That's why during the overhead squat, you know, if we see somebody who has an excessive low back arch, we actually will have them do that with their arms down. And then if that low back arch goes away and gets back to like a neutral posture, we know that it's not so much an anterior pelvic tilt that's happening from like their hip flexors. It's really, really tight lats that are causing excessive spinal extension from the upper body. So that's the muscle spindle, right? And the thing about muscle spindles, guys, they are filthy liars. They love to lie to your brain and say, hey, we're at 100% max length and we can't stretch any further, when you totally can. You know, like my hamstrings are the muscle spindles of my hamstrings are the filthiest liars on this planet. They love to tell my brain, no, you can't stretch any further. And so then when I go to like touch my toes, you know, I'll hinge at the waist, and then it's like, no, you can't go any further. So then it'll buckle my knees or it'll arch my back. It'll find some way, any way to keep from stretching out because it is trying to keep from getting pulled too far. So that's what a muscle spindle is, right? Now, you've got another sensory receptor that is working in conjunction with your muscle spindle. That's your Golgi tendon organ. They're sensitive to changes in muscular tension. And so muscular tension, right, that's going to be located at the tendon. Now, they're also in charge of making sure that you don't get damaged. So like they're also there to make sure that you don't experience overstretching, because if you ever experience overstretching, it'll pull your muscle right off your bone. And it can be absolutely brutal, you know? And so the Golgi tendon organ is there to sense that. And so if you experience like a lot of tension, sometimes the Golgi tendon organ, it will actually kind of give up and just turn that muscle off and say, hey, there's too much tension. You know what? Let's stop creating this tension. and it just relaxes the muscle as much as possible. And that's sort of a protective mechanism. And we take advantage of that. We actually take advantage of Golgi tendon organs and their ability to kind of cause a muscle to relax, right? And we do that by putting pressure on them, which causes them to activate, and they kind of freak out. And that's why it actually kind of hurts when you're doing this. I say hurts, and it's uncomfortable. And so we do that by either stretching a muscle into like full length, right? So let's say like I had a wall here and I was stretching out my pec, right? I would do this like big long stretch right here. Well, the tendons are now being pulled apart. So the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon organ are both freaking out, right? The muscle spindle is saying, hey, we're at full length and we can't go any further, right? And that's why my body's trying to contract back the other way. And then the Golgi tendon organ's going, yeah, we got a lot of tension here. It's pulling on the bone. But here's the thing. If I put prolonged pressure on that Golgi tendon organ, the Golgi tendon organ will either realize that there is very little tension and that I'm moving nice and safe because I'm doing this big, long, gentle hold, right? Like a static stretch. So it'll either realize there's very little tension and it's actually very safe to stretch even further, or it will go, there's too much. The safest option is to stop resisting this and go with the flow. And it will then inhibit that muscle spindle and say, shut up, relax, lengthen out the muscle. And it's a protective mechanism that we take advantage of. We call that process autogenic inhibition, right? Pressure on the Golgi tendon organ. And that's either going to be through like pushing on it, maybe with like foam rolling, massage, or using some type of technique, or just stretching it from end to end. Both of those put pressure on Golgi tendon organs. So autogenic inhibition is either a response to too much stress, or it's a response to your body realizing, hey, I'm supposed to be able to stand like this. This is posture. And it's like, oh my God, we've been in the wrong position for years. Like that's sort of what autogenic inhibition is. It's a way to sort of wake your nervous system up and to, get your proprioception back. And that's why you feel really good after you stretch out. That's why, all of us feel so relaxed. You've got one other receptor there that's also sending information, and those are your joint receptors. And your joint receptors are responsible for sensing pressure and acceleration and deceleration inside of your joints. So when you look at like joint receptors, my internet, don't you die on me, I swear. I can't have that. It's so annoying. So joint receptors, they're all inside of here in like your ligaments and stuff. I love this one, by the way, Golgi Mazzoni corpuscles. That's such a great freaking name. Pacino-uniform corpuscles. These are really similar to the ones that are in your skin, actually. So these little like receptors that are in here, they're in charge of sensing like, is there like a really rapid acceleration or a really rapid deceleration? And so like when that happens, your body can go, whoa, 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 and then it can cause like a muscle to contract or cause a muscle to relax if it has to. So again, like, these are all working together to tell your brain what position your body's in, right? Again, I always think of it as like, if I gave you 3 pieces of information, there is an animal, it has feathers, and it goes quack, right? Those 3 pieces of information, you're running those 3 pieces of information in your brain across your past experiences. Like, okay, well, if it goes quack, it's a duck, it's got feathers, it's a bird, when birds are ducks, so that makes sense. And it's an animal, right? Okay, that makes sense. And so then it's like, is it a duck? Right, you're putting all the information together, right? The same thing's happening. That's how you have proprioception. Your muscle spindle saying, hey, the deltoid is at this much length, and the Golgi tendon organ saying, yeah, and the tendons that attach that deltoid are at this much tension. And then the joint receptors are saying, yeah, and we're accelerating at about this pace. And there's this much pressure inside the shoulder joint. So then your brain's going, oh, okay, so we're doing this, right? And that's how it's understanding where it is in space. Thanks to mechanoreceptors, you have your proprioception. But like I said, muscle spindles, Golgi, all of them, they can be filthy liars. And that is how you have altered proprioception, which is so common, right? We end up moving the wrong way for years. Our body gets used to it. And so then like we have altered proprioception. So what's cool about your nervous system is like your folks, when you're training them, they're going to get stronger pretty rapidly. Actually, in the beginning stages, they're going to experience like increases in strength and energy and things like that. A lot of those changes actually are not because I love this, by the way. This is one of my favorite things that's in the book, and they don't tell you the other half of the story, which is beginner clients. You'll be working with them 2-3 weeks, and they'll go like, I feel so much better. I feel so much stronger. And I'm like, that's great. That's exactly, what we're going for. And that's 100% true. They feel better because they are getting better. But I also love it how they go, and I looked in the mirror this morning and I saw like a little definition in my arms. I'm like, after 2, okay. Yeah, totally, sure. They'll often tie like the way they feel to the way they sort of perceive themselves, which is totally classic human, and a good thing, like that's fine. Like it gives them more confidence. I love it. So, foster that. That's great. But a lot of early stage improvements are not because you're gaining muscle mass or. Okay, so picking up, we just lost our internet for a second. So a lot of times early stage improvements in your clients, their nervous system's getting better, they're developing proprioception, they're getting stronger, but it's because their nervous system is learning how to do the movements much more so than the fact that they are gaining muscle mass. But we do know that the way we look is tied to the way we feel, and the way we feel is tied to the way we sort of perceive ourselves. So that's great. Nothing wrong with that, foster that. All right. Let's go ahead and move through the skeletal system here. So your skeletal system is another part of your kinetic chain, and it is going to act as the framework for your body. This is also going to act as a resting ground for all of your muscles, and it is comprised of all of your bones in your body that are coming together to form joints where 2 bones are meeting, and then there's a bunch of special structures in those joints to hold those 2 bones together and provide stability and things like that. So this is protecting delicate structures, it's providing a framework for your body, and it's acting as levers so that your muscular system can move stuff around. Which is great, right? Like I've got a lever here and I got a lever here, and so when this little muscle that runs from here to here, when it goes like that, it shortens and manipulates my body. So the divisions you've got, right? The two, this is kind of like the nervous system in a way, right? Like it's going to divide into 2 main sections. You've got your axial skeleton, which is your skull, your rib cage, and your vertebrae. So like it's actually there to really kind of protect most of the delicate structures like in here, your heart and lungs, for instance, which are 2 of the most important parts of your body. And then your vertebral column is protecting your spinal cord, which is the most important part of your body. That's keeping your central nervous system protected. And then you've got your appendicular skeleton. That's your arms and your legs. That's your shoulder girdle, which attaches your arms to the axial skeleton, and your pelvic girdle, which is attaching your legs to your axial skeleton. So in your skeletal system, like I said, it's made up of bones, and those bones come together to form joints, right? So if we kind of lay out all the structures that make up the skeletal system, it's bones, joints, and connective tissue, all the connective tissue in those joints. So your bones, these are acting as levers, like I said, in order for your muscular system to be able to manipulate and move things around. So, they provide these big long levers, muscles attached to those levers, and then when a muscle like shortens, it moves that lever around, and that produces, your human movement. And then, it wouldn't be able to actually move any of that around without joints. And joints are the articulation of 2 or more bones coming together, right? So when 2 bones are meeting, and that allows them to kind of, like I said, be manipulated, right? This space in between them, that is your joint. Now, you get a couple different types of joints in the body. You've got non-synovial joints, which they don't have a joint cavity. There's very, very little space in between them. And so they're held together with like a little bit of like maybe some cartilage, or sometimes it's just like fibrous connective tissue. They're really not designed to move, For instance, like your skull is made up of a bunch of different bones actually coming together, but we don't want the parts of our skull to move around. But your jaw, that's a synovial joint. So that actually does have like lots of range of motion. Then we've got, like I said, your synovial joints, right? And synovial joints, those are your fully movable joints. These are joints that you are designed to be able to actually move things around. I'm realizing I'm kind of out of order on this PowerPoint. So you're in your synovial joints, right? You know, these they have like a big joint cavity. There's lots of space in there. And so, you know, they produce things like synovial fluid, which is sort of like grease on a hinge. That's there to make sure that like there's not too much friction inside of these two very hard tissues moving around. You've also got cartilage, which is like gonna cap on your bones to make sure that, again, there's not too much friction, you know, because bones are very hard and, you know, they would get worn down if you were to rub them too much. And so cartilage and synovial fluid is there to make sure there's not as much of that. But then also there's things like fat pads, bursa, which are like fluid pads, and there's all kinds of other materials in there. All of that is in there to kind of make sure that like you can deal with the impact on your skeletal system, because we don't want that hard tissue to wear down over time. You know, we want to make sure that we have plenty of soft tissue inside of there to prevent friction and prevent damage and act as a cushion. But we also have to be able to tie our bones together. We got to make sure they do stay connected, and that's where ligaments come in. Ligaments are structures that are going to connect your bones to your other bones, and they tend to repair a little bit slowly, which is why we're often worried about ligaments when it comes to corrective exercise. We're trying to make sure that our clients develop strong ligaments as much as possible. If you ever sprained an ankle, that's a torn ligament. And so, you know, because they don't have as much blood flow in them, you know, they tend to repair a little bit slowly, similar to the way tendons act in the body. Tendons are acting as an attachment for muscles to bones. Ligaments are attaching bones to other bones. Both of them don't get very much blood flow. Both of them tend to repair a little bit slowly. And both are incredibly important. Yeah. So looking at bone growth, right? So your nervous system, or I'm sorry, your skeletal system is going to grow over time. I'm going to add this into our notes. I'm not sure why this isn't in here, actually. So when we look at like bone growth, right? This is going to be bones will develop due to a process called bone remodeling. And bone remodeling is the process where you are experiencing these specialized cells in your skeletal system, which are breaking down or building up new bone tissue. So you've got what are called osteoblasts, or osteoclasts, we'll start with, clasts, which are bone, specialized cells responsible for resorbing old or damaged bone tissue, right? So you can think of these as your bone breakers, right? They're in charge of like breaking down old bone tissue. Now that sounds really bad because it's like, don't we want lots of bone tissue? But if your bone tissue is imperfect or damaged or doesn't have like a structure that's very effective, we want to break that old bone tissue down so that we can create new effective bone tissue. And that is where your osteoblasts come in, right? And these are specialized cells responsible for building up new bone tissue, right? And so these are your bone builders, right? And so, you know, as we're young and we're making all kinds of new bone tissue, our osteoblasts are super, super active. And our osteoclasts, you know, they aren't really doing much. But as we get older, our osteoclasts, for some reason, become more active and it breaks down our bone tissue. Now, here's the thing. If you create imperfections in your skeletal system, your body will resorb that old bone so that it can lay down new bone tissue to make it stronger. That's why exercise has been shown to increase your bone density. And that's something we want to do. We want to make sure that we are breaking our bones down in a way that's like safe and effective so that our body can build that back up and increase that density, and then we're less likely to deal with an actual fracture. So we got a couple different types of bones out there. You've got long bones, which are long in nature, your femur, your tibia, even your fingers, you know, they're not as long as like my femur is, but they are longer than they are anything else, you know? So like you know, my palm, right? The little bones in here, those are long bones, right? Then you've also got short bones. Short bones tend to be like cubical in nature, so like the bones of your wrist. So a whole bunch of little square bones in here, a whole bunch of little square bones in your ankles, right? Those are your short bones. You've got flat bones, which tend to be really thin, kind of protect delicate structures, like we said. Your scapula, your pelvis are good examples of that. And then you've got unique or irregular bones. And these are kind of specialized in shape and structure. Your vertebrae is a great example of that. It's there to protect your spinal column, but it also has like a place for like nervous roots to kind of branch out from. So on your bones, you're going to see specialized like bone markings, right? And so when you look at like your bone markings, you're going to have two major categories here. So bone markings are specialized shapes on our bones that are acting as sites for muscles and other connective tissues to attach, right? So your bone markings are going to give your muscles a place to rest so they can get a really good grip and then pull that bone around and make it move, right? So the two major types that you've got are going to be depressions, which are indentations that act as attachment sites for muscles, and projections, right, or processes. And processes, which are projections on bones that act as attachment sites for muscles, right? So for instance, you've got like the greater trochanter of your femur here, right? When you look at like that, right, it's this big freaking knob on the outside of your femur, right? So there's like the head and the neck of your femur here, but this little knob right here, that is acting as a place for like your TFL to attach, right? And it's going to run from like your pelvis up here, and it can get a good grip on the outside here, right? And then it can run down. But you've also got, if we look right here, actually, this little tuberosity right here, this little dent, that is actually where your glutes are going to insert. And so they got a really good grip right there. And then you got a little lesser trochanter right here. So there's all kinds of these little itty bitty projections on your femur. And you can see that allows like muscles to get a really good place to kind of grab stuff. And that grabbing is what allows your muscles to manipulate your skeleton. We want to make sure they have a really good grip. So special parts of your skeletal system, obviously your vertebral column is, like I said, it's a bunch of unique bones. So you've got your cervical vertebrae, which is sort of like your upper neck, your thoracic vertebrae, which is the largest section, that's your mid back, mid and upper back, your lumbar vertebrae, which is sort of often where most of the damage occurs, and that's like your lower back. You know, this is dealing with all the weight of your entire body coming down. And then you've got your sacrum and coccyx down here, which is your tailbone. Now, in your bones, right, you've got all kinds of different like joint structures as well. So again, we go back to like what a joint is, right? It's the articulation of two bones kind of coming together, right? And so there's two major categories. There's non-synovial and synovial. And synovial joints are the ones that can actually create like movements, right? So your synovial joints have synovial fluid, they have a joint cavity, and they can create all kinds of different movements. We got three sort of major categories of movements here. You're either going to see like a rolling action, right? And so like a bone can roll across the surface of another bone, or a sliding action where a bone can slide across the surface of another bone, or a spinning action where one bone can sort of pivot around the surface of another bone. And so those are sort of like the three main types of joint movements we have inside our body. And so the one thing we need to remember is that your entire skeletal system is kind of combined together. I'm actually gonna, you know what, I'm gonna move all this up. I don't like having this here. Sorry, 1 second. There we go. And then let's actually take this whole thing and indent. There we go. All right. So when we look at like those joints, right? going back to the idea of the kinetic chain, it is a chain, right? Well, your skeletal system really personifies that. When you see like one bone move around, it will directly affect the movement of your other bones because all those joints are connected. So if my, when I look at like pronation distortion syndrome, which is that feet turn out, knees cave in action, right? When this ankle collapses, that's causing this to inwardly rotate, which causes this to inwardly rotate, which is also going to happen at my hip as well. It's not what I'm looking for. That's also going to happen at my hip as well, right? So now my hip is internally rotating, my knees are adducting, my tibia is internally rotating, and my ankle is being externally rotated. And then that's going to cause, all kinds of problems like, there it is, IT band syndrome, for instance. When this muscle starts rubbing around the outside because I've got an uneven, posture here. That's one of the things that can happen. You can get all kinds of other issues as well. So, one joint being messed up, it will absolutely affect your other ones. Now, like I said, ligaments, right? When you look at those as like a structure, right? These are going to connect bones to other bones. So in your joints, like I said, you have ligaments. They are structures that connect bone to bone. We draw them in white because they are characterized by low blood flow. And that low blood flow means they don't get nutrients delivered very often. They repair very slowly. So we want to strain our ligaments in a very positive way. We want to put positive stress on our ligaments. How do we do that? Well, we perform exercises, right? But because we know that they are, limited blood flow, we have to put stress on them for extended periods of time. And that's why we do high repetitions and we do a slow tempo so that there's lots of time under tension. That gives my blood flow time to get into my ligaments. And that's why we have the stabilization phase. Stabilization phase, by moving slow and by moving for a high number of repetitions and being in an unstable environment, my joints are constantly learning how to stabilize. I am stressing my tendons and ligaments. And that's why, that's why we always start our clients there, because then we can teach their muscles how to get really strong later and sort of move the body in for high levels of force once my joints can move the way they're designed to move, So it's about training my nerve. Yeah, that's what stabilization is. It's about training my nervous system and repairing my, tendons and ligaments as well, all my connective tissue. So when it comes to our skeletal system, we do know that weight-bearing exercise has the most positive effects. So when I say weight-bearing, what I'm referring to is, things that are working directly against gravity. So if I want to have a strong skeletal system, I need to participate in weight-bearing exercises. So we think like things like running, lifting weights, calisthenics, it's body weight, but it's still gravity, right? All of those are weight-bearing. I love swimming. I love cycling. Both those are really great, but those are more like friction, so they're not quite the same type of resistance. Hasn't been shown to have as many positive effects on the skeletal system. Now that being said, doesn't mean swimming isn't incredibly good for you, because it totally is, or cycling isn't good for you. It's just those are great ways to train your cardiovascular system. But if I have a client with like osteoporosis or something, I'm going to put a little special emphasis on weight training, just because that's going to have that positive effect I'm looking for. So it's a great way to maintain healthy bones and muscles, and also burns calories, so we love it. And that is your nervous and skeletal system in a nutshell. So summarizing everything up today, we know that the kinetic chain, obviously 3 interdependent systems working together. Your nervous system is the communication network, and your skeletal system acts as the framework. And that's that. You guys have any questions before my internet craps out again? And I become a ball of anger. Questions, comments, concerns today, guys? Yeah, what's up, Irene?
So, Brad, synovial, that's what our bones are mostly made of? I mean, is that non-synovial is our jaw?
You mean your joints, not your bones?
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, 80%, I think. 80% of your joints are synovial. Most of your joints are designed to move, but like if you look at like non-synovial joints, right? You'll see like 2 major categories. You'll see like this version, which is like a fibrous joint. And a fibrous joint is literally just like, you know, this hard tissue that really is not designed to like create any movement. And then you'll sometimes see, cartilaginous, oh, thank God, cartilaginous joints. So for instance, like this little bit of like material in here, or like this is the classic example, like the two parts of your pelvis come together. It really isn't designed to move much, right? It can move a little, you know, it's designed to do just little bits of movements here and there, but it's really not designed to move that much. That's a semi-movable joint. So if you want to think of it, the way I always kind of think of it in my head, you can we kind of generally, usually when we're teaching this stuff, we split it into two categories, synovial and non-synovial, and then non-synovial is split into two more categories, fibrous and cartilaginous. But I mean, you can just think of it as like fully movable, semi-movable, non-movable. And I like that version better, personally. But that's not how it's normally taught. Does that answer your question? Cool. Anything else, guys? All right. Well, have a great rest of your day. Keep an eye on the news. If you haven't voted, get out there and go knock it out. And I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Have fun on the trail, Brad.
Yeah, I will. I'm excited to get out there and distract myself for a couple hours.
Nice. See you tomorrow.
All right. See you tomorrow. Yeah, I'm like worried that like I'm gonna go out there and then I'll, you know, be out in nature and I'll come off the trail and then the world will be ended. God. All right, man.
All right, I'll see you.
See ya.